Next session, Jallianwala Bagh. It's a book launch, and the moderator is Sheheryar Badar Sheikh. He's currently a lecturer, a teacher, scholar, doctoral fellow, and PhD candidate. We just have 30 minutes. His coming of age debut novel, The Mic is On. The Still Point of the Turning World was nominated for last year's Adab Festival Gets Pharma Fiction Prize. His recent novel, Call Me Al, is going to be launched tomorrow. He has an MFA in creative writing. Can you take the mic and start the session, please?
Hello. Assalamu alaikum.
Dr. Faisal Nazir will also be moderating. Both will moderate.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to start pretty quickly. Dr. Faisal Nazir will be taking over the moderating charge, and he's got the best questions, so I think he's going to start. Should we first, Dr. Nazir, start with Professor Robinson's contextualization and history of the event of Jallianwala Bagh?
Definitely, sure.
Is it automatically on? Yes, it is. Okay. Right, good afternoon. I've been asked to give some sort of context for the terrible incident in Amritsar at the Jallianwala Bagh in 1919. I would begin just by telling you briefly how people in my parents' generation thought about it. If you think about most Britons, they probably didn't think about it at all. But those who were aware, certainly from those who I met in relation to my parents and other friends who knew about India, there was a sense of deep shame in relation to the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. It was felt to be a blot, a major blot on British rule. About 50 years ago, doing research in the India Office archives, I did read many of the papers and the correspondence relating to the Jallianwala Bagh incident. And it's using that memory, going back 50 years, that I'm just going to say or speak to you briefly today. One thing, what I say is not to excuse what happened. Please, it is not to excuse a firing in which over 400 people were killed and over 1,000 wounded. It is not to excuse it, but just to perhaps explain a bit about why it happened. First of all, it's important to remember that in the British psyche, the Punjab was a rather special place. It was different from the rest of India. And it was a special place in large part because most of the Indian army was actually recruited from the Punjab. It was also a place in which the British took pride in ruling in a rather different way from much of the rest of India. So perhaps an important thing to bear in mind initially is the exceptionality of the Punjab and what it meant in the British psyche. Now, in the period leading up to 1919, things have been changing very rapidly. One reason to this was the impact of the First World War on the economy in India in general, but of the Punjab in particular. It had been affected very substantially by the demands of raising large numbers of troops, by the demands of raising large quantities of foodstuffs and so on in order to fight the war. So the economy had been seriously affected, of the Punjab, had been seriously affected by World War I. Just before 1919, in the 12 months before, a large quantity of troops raised from the Punjab had been demobilized. So the British were very aware that suddenly in the Punjab they had a lot of people who were no longer under their command, but actually had serious military skills. And they were concerned about how they might respond in a case of anarchy. Another dimension, which is often not taken, or often not mentioned at all, is that the Afghans were actually in the process of invading northern India at this time, only across the frontier, but nevertheless, it was the kind of invasion that gave hope to resistance to British rule in India. In the immediate period before 1919, what got things moving in terms of politics was one, there was a thought which was creating a great deal of fresh aspiration that India was going to be given a major boon as a result of its huge contributions to the imperial war effort. Secondly, the British had rather spoiled the impact of this understanding by introducing something called the Rowlatt legislation, which was designed to suppress, discourage and suppress forms of resistance, political resistance to British rule. This was felt that if you had to pass legislation like that, you couldn't really be serious in giving new powers to Indians which had been promised as a result of their engagement with the war. In the immediate beginnings, Mahatma Gandhi had said, had launched a satyagraha against the Rowlatt legislation, which was encouraging people to resist. So you had a situation in which a leading figure in the Indian nationalist movement was leading a process of resistance against British rule. Martial law had been declared in the Punjab. And it was in this context, well, before we get there, there had also been some rather, from the British point of view, rather worrying incidents in Amritsar, a particular one in which two missionaries, lady missionaries, had been roughed up by Indians, and as a result, the government in Amritsar compelled Indians walking along the street where they had been roughed up, not to walk, but to crawl, and to kiss the paving stones as they did so.
On that note, Professor Robinson, shall we take it to some of the texts within the book?
Certainly, yes.
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah.
I'd like to get Mr. Raza Naeem involved in this. Mr. Raza is the only Pakistani contributor to this volume, and he is a translator and literary historian. So, Raza Sahab, I'd like you to tell us a bit about this book, what it is, and I'd like you to especially comment on this point W.B. Yeats made about Wilfred Owen's poetry, refusing to include it in Oxford Book of Modern Verse, saying that passive suffering is no theme for poetry. So do these literary pieces, they have more than simply a record of passive suffering, or they, tell us about resilience of the human spirit in times like these? Thank you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Faisal. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this festival for inviting me here and making it possible for me to talk about this book. Actually, I became part of this work almost by accident. Rakhshanda Jalil, who is the editor and compiler of this volume. She's an old friend and collaborator and conspirator, if you like. We usually keep in touch on email. I've been lucky to meet her in Lucknow and Delhi on 2 occasions. That was when it was still possible to go to India. She has unfortunately turned her attention away from Pakistan. So now we mostly correspond on email. So I think the whole of the year, which was the 100th anniversary of the massacre, she was just sending me emails asking, Raza, do you know so-and-so short story writer who has written about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre? And I was really curious. I was not really getting a lot of traction. I was saying, why? I mean, I am just a lowly translator, and why is someone so distinguished, asking me something like that? I tried to answer her according to my limited capacities. So at one point I got really curious and I asked her, Appa, I call her Rakhshanda Appa, and I said, Appa, would you please tell me what is this for? Why are you badgering me with these questions, And then she said that I'm actually doing a volume on Jallianwala Bagh, and this is why I've been badgering you. And it's not that she didn't badger me before, but so I was curious. I said, who are the contributors and which writers are you going to include? And then she was very kind. And, and then I said, might there be room for a Pakistani translator? Maybe, she said, we are going to go to the press very soon. So if you've got to do it, you've got to do it very, very quickly. And then she said that, why don't you translate, Krishan Chandra's Amritsar Azadi Se Pehle? And, Krishan Chandra is one of my favorite writers. I mean, after Manto, if I've translated anyone, it is Krishan Chandra. So she sent me the text, and I think I did it in 4 days. I was working full time at a school as a coordinator, and it's not the most pleasant of jobs, So luckily my office was in the library where people normally don't come a lot, So I was stealing time from my coordination, not really coordinating actually. So I somehow, became part of this collection. Remember, this is November, December 2018. So the cutoff point was really close. So I just managed to do it, and now I think about it, I'm so proud because, I think it is the only collection of its kind. You have standard history accounts of the massacre, and historians are very notorious because for them even 100 years is not a sufficient amount of time to evaluate an event, But for poets and writers, the memorialization begins immediately. There are some very fabulous poets and writers in this collection, for example. Nanak Singh, for example. We don't talk about Nanak Singh a lot. He was a son of the soil. He was born in what is now Jhelum, near Pind Dadan Khan. He is a son of the soil. But we don't talk about him a lot, do we? And he wrote a searing poem on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre within months of the massacre because he was a survivor, the poem sold like hotcakes because it was sold for 1 anna, as was the publishing thing in those days. So the British, good at that they are at spotting these things, they immediately banned this work and they burnt copies of it. But like all good record keepers, they sent 1 copy to the British Library. They always have good records. We haven't learned anything from them. We call ourselves post-colonial, but if there is anything we need to learn from the British, it is about the value of record keeping. So, and after 60 years, no one talked about that poem, and Nanak Singh went on to become a very distinguished poet. But he wouldn't talk about the poem. He hinted at it. So long after he passed away, Gyani Zail Singh became the president of India. He was the first Sikh president of India. He was an admirer of Nanak Singh, so he knew about this poem. So he used his good offices to go to the British Library, and I've been to the library, and they've stored everything on microfilm. They've got a fantastic collection of South Asian archives. So the microfilm was brought back to India. A lot was made about it. The poem was published after 60 years. It was given up for lost. I mean, you could write a book even about the publication history of this poem. So it became a sensation. It was translated into English. So you have poems like that, and they give you an immediate account. There is a section on the poem about Hindu-Muslim unity. This was after partition, during partition, that we said Hindu water, Muslim water, Musalman pani, Hindu pani. But at that point in time, they were celebrating Ram Navami, which is the birthday of Ram. Muslims and Hindus, in the poem, they were drinking freely from each other's vessels. And this was frightening for the English, because that is what they did not want. So when you talk about standard historical accounts, they miss these things, and I've taught history, we teach history like dead people, or dead white people or dead brown people, who came, who did what to whom, who killed, who conquered. But history is more than just, a repertoire of events. I think there are flesh and blood people who were affected, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs. So it is poets and writers who make that event come alive. And this was, I think, the point why Rakhshanda Appa made this collection. Because in the interstices where the historians can't reach, it is the poets and writers who stitch together this whole pastiche of events. And Nanak Singh is just one of the poets or writers who is represented here. So this is how I actually came to this project. And about your second question, the British may be very good record keepers, but they don't want to remember the past, So I tell my British friends, I think, what is happening to you now, you deserve it, Brexit and everything, because you've been going around the 20th century dividing and cutting up people everywhere in the world. You went to Cyprus, you divided them. You went to Palestine, you divided them. You went to our part of the world, you divided them. And even Ireland was not good enough for you. So what is happening to you serves you right. Now you know what it is like. You're a medium-sized, small European country, and they don't like it, very much, So this is, we call it poetic justice, I don't know if I'm making a lot of sense, but I think, it doesn't matter if the British don't apologize about it. There's a financial aspect involved also, because if they apologize, then there will be financial reparations. There will be a demand for financial reparations from not only the Indians, but every part of the world where the British went and messed things up. And this is the reason it was very nauseating when the royal couple came to Lahore and people were fawning over their dresses, hi, this Pakistani designer has dressed him, this. And it was nauseating because, this was the year of the centenary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. How could you even think about, pressing and preening and fawning over the royal couple when they have patently excused themselves from apologizing for this horrific massacre? And by the way, this was not the last massacre which occurred under the British watch. We hardly talk about the Kissa Khwani Bazar massacre, which happened in April 1930 at the height of the Salt March, But I hope I've answered your question.
I was under the impression that the British Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, when he visited India in 2015 or 2016, he did actually apologize. I got an agreement here, but a disagreement from you. Okay. He did actually apologize. So, a little bit of balance, please.
A little late, and there were some reparations offered that many of the survivors did not accept. And I think rightfully so. It's not something that can be compensated. I would like to talk more about literary representation of it, and then we'll come to the book. I study apocalypses. I've studied the Holocaust, and I'm interested in disaster studies. And there are two theories about apocalypses and apocalyptic events. In the face of them, and I study specifically 9/11 as an apocalyptic event. So in the face of such a disastrous, such an unassimilable event, such as Jallianwala Bagh, such as the Holocaust, such as any such massacre, even in your personal life, such as the death of your child or the death of your father, and that you're not ready for it. An apocalyptic event has two reactions that the audience of it or the recipient of it can have. According to Adorno, you go completely quiet. There is no response to an apocalyptic event, especially cultural response. Nothing in writing can contribute to the event. You can't actually respond, you can't assimilate, you can't say anything. And on the other hand, Derrida says that the apocalypse is inevitable, it's going to happen, and in the face of it, all we can do is talk. Talk, build discourse, which will mean nothing by the time the apocalypse comes. But still, we can do nothing but talk, even before it, during it, after it. Nothing will assimilate what is absolute. This collection, I stayed up all night reading it. It was a fascinating collection, but I found it of a single note. Maybe it's because many of the texts have been taken from before partition. I think only Manto's text is from after partition. What did you find when you were contributing to it? Did you find nuances in the tone? And was there enough said about the event, around the event, of the event? And does it actually contribute to our understanding of the event?
Thank you. I think I would like to correct you there. The text I have translated, Krishan Chandra's Amritsar Azadi se pehle, Amritsar before independence, that was actually written in 1948. It is part of his collection of stories called Hum Vahshi Hain, we are savages. And of course, Manto has a very interesting relationship with Jallianwala Bagh. I've written about it elsewhere because he witnessed it. He was a 9-year-old boy when this happened, and his first short story, Tamasha, actually chronicles that whole. It talks about the pain of Jallianwala Bagh from the point of view of a 9-year-old child. And of course, I teach sociology, and in sociology we say that societies like ours are not child-centered societies like the West. So we don't understand how a child is trying to define something from his point of view. So here is a young Saadat Hasan Manto in the story called Tamasha. He is Khalid. And he's asking his father, when are we going to go to the fair? I want to see the spectacle. I want to see the spectacle. And what is the spectacle? That spectacle is the spectacle which unearthed on the 13th of April 1919, when 400 people were killed on that day. And, the British are sending planes and they're dropping leaflets saying whoever goes out there tonight will be made an example of. And, this 9-year-old child, he's been sitting at home for days. School is off. He can't meet his friend, and he's pestering his father, when are we going to go? Ye tamasha ho raha hai, hum kab jayenge? When are we going to go? And the father is, his face is white as hell. He's saying, no, he's trying to put him off. He's saying, go into your room, go and study. So, and now, of course, what status children have in modern Pakistani society. So it gives a very, and of course, Manto had reason to rethink and think about Jallianwala Bagh. I think of all the great short story writers of the subcontinent, he has written the most about Jallianwala Bagh. He wrote 3 stories before the partition of India, and then when he migrated to Pakistan, he had a sort of flashback. And this is why one of the best stories written on Jallianwala Bagh is 1919 Ki Ek Baat, or An Incident of 1919. It tells the story of Jallianwala Bagh from the point of view of a prostitute. Here is another member of society we don't like to talk about a lot. Polite society doesn't like to talk about courtesans and prostitutes as political subjects, because this right is only ascribed to normal human beings, you know. So Manto was a student of the French literature. He translated Victor Hugo, and he knew, you know, he had read Maupassant's story Mademoiselle Fifi, which is a classic short story. And the legend is that in the French Revolution, the first bullet was hit upon a prostitute. So he consciously made the hero of this story as a pimp, you know, who shows more courage than normal men, normal women, and dies at the front of the agitation. You know, he's killed and he's trying to strangle this British soldier while he's doing it. Well, I think obviously there is room for more commemoration, and you know, 1919 was not just a tragedy for this part of the world. I mean, I like to situate it in a global situation, you know. 1919 marked the end of the First World War, and there was a huge influenza epidemic, and you know, the British Empire was still not, you know, the sun still had to set on the British Empire, you know, and you know, everywhere in the world there were countries which were talking about being represented, you know, small voices, you know, at the Paris Peace Conference, because everyone wanted a place in the sun. Even Uncle Ho Chi Minh, you know, he had hopes from Harold Wilson, you know. He rented a morning suit. He was a student in Paris. He rented a morning suit just to go and meet President Wilson, because he set great store by Wilson's words that we are the upholders of democracy. We are going to give freedom. Of course, the meeting never took place. So, you know, I think the best thing to remember Jallianwala Bagh is not to see it as an isolated incident, you know. I think one has to connect the dots, you know. And this is where social scientists, unfortunately, I mean, you know, they are probably limited by their disciplinary limitations. You know, I think if we look at the world map, many things were happening in 1919. You know, even the country where you come from, Canada, there was a huge general strike in Winnipeg, you know. And there's an event called Bloody Sunday, you know. I've been to Winnipeg, by the way. And, you know, many people were killed just for the right to you know, a decent wage, just for the right to have those rights which now democracies everywhere take for granted. So I think I would rather disagree with you that why do we only talk about commemorating Jallianwala Bagh, however insufficiently it is. Why don't we talk about, I mean, memory is a form of resistance, in my opinion. You know, whether you remember it sufficiently or insufficiently is a secondary question.
Could I just offer one comment? All the time I hear my friend talking about Jallianwala Bagh, I'm also thinking about India's Operation Blue Star in Amritsar, in which rather more people were killed and rather greater brutality took place. It doesn't excuse either incident, but we need to be aware that this kind of thing can happen in democracies as well as in imperial situations.
All right, so I think if we can have a little bit of reading from the book, especially from your translation of Krishan Chandra's story, I think that's a wonderful translation, and you know, it brings the feelings alive. I felt like I was reading it the original.
Well, I mean, I have dramatized this story in Urdu, and I mean, it left up. I mean, you know, Krishan Chandra was, you know, he did his master's in English literature from FC College in Lahore, and he shifted to India after partition. Until his dying day, he pined to visit Lahore. You know, you know, when FC College held a centenary commemoration for him in 2014, I was invited to read this story in Urdu, and it left quite a huge stir. The part I want to read is about the women, because again, this is a manual, right? And we don't We hardly talk about women, but there were women heroines of Amritsar. I think Sheheryar alluded to that. There was a woman called Ratan Devi who spent all night by the corpse of her husband on Jallianwala Bagh with a stick in her hand, because there were jackals barking, there were dogs howling, coming to get the dead bodies. And there was a boy who was crying out for water, and he was asking, please don't go. I feel very scared. So Ratan Devi, she stood guard with a single stick in her hand all night, guarding the dead body of her husband, preventing it from mutilation, and all those wounded crying and people soaking in their own blood. And remember, the British behaved very callously. No medical aid, no ambulances allowed. Curfew was imposed so that the relatives could not even take the dead bodies and burn them or cremate them or bury them according to their religious rites. So this woman there, and she even helped a few Jat men climb the wall and get out of that Jallianwala Bagh. So after the event, the British tried to offer her compensation, and she refused to accept any compensation. And there's a fantastic museum which the Indians have built in Amritsar. So her name is there as a hero, But she is just one woman whose account has come to us. The other women are in this story. This story, and I'm going to read it. It was not curfew time yet. 4 women of Kucha Ramdas, 2 Muslim, 1 Sikh and 1 Hindu, came to buy vegetables. They passed the front of the sacred Gurdwara. All of them paid their respects and, turning their faces away, busied themselves in buying vegetables. They had to return very soon. The curfew was about to begin, and the air echoed with the call of the martyrs' blood. But still they got late while talking and buying provisions. And as they turned to leave, just a few minutes remained in the curfew. Begum said, "Come, let's go through this alley. We will be home well in time." Paro said, "But the Goras are on guard there." Sham Kaur replied, "And these Goras cannot be trusted." Zainab said, "They won't bother us. We will just pass with our veils drawn. Come quickly." All 4 women entered the alley. The soldier said, "Salute this flag. This is the Union Jack." The women saluted the flag, flustered. "Now get out of here immediately by crossing on your knees from here to there," the soldier said, pointing to the length of the road. "On our knees? We can't do this," Zainab said timidly. "Oh, you must crawl. The Sarkar's orders. Drag yourself on your knees." "We will go as we please," Sham Kaur said proudly. "Let's see who dares to stop us." She began to walk. "Stop, stop," Paro said, petrified. "Stop, stop," the Gora said. "I will shoot." Sham Kaur was walking straight. Time, a bullet whizzed past. Sham Kaur fell. Zainab and Begum looked at each other, and then both of them fell on their knees. The Gora was pleased, thinking they were following the Sarkar's orders. Zainab and Begum fell on their knees, raised both their hands, and after a silence of a few moments, both stood up straight and began to cross the alley. The Gora was left stupefied. Then his cheeks flickered with anger, and he straightened his rifle. Time, time. 2 more bullets were shot. Paro began to cry. "Now I too will have to die. What misfortune! My husband, my children, my mother, my father, my brothers. Please forgive me. Today I too will have to die. I don't want to die, but still I have to. I cannot leave my sisters to die alone." Paro advanced, crying. The Gora gently instructed her. "No need to cry. Just follow the Sarkar's orders and cross this alley like this by falling on your knees. Then nobody will harm you." The Gora explained the manner of walking to her by himself falling on his knee. Paro came near the Gora crying. The Gora now stood straight haughtily. Paro spat on his face forcefully, and then turning back, began to cross the alley. She was walking straight proudly in the center of the alley, and the Gora was looking at her with amazement. A few moments later, he straightened his gun, and Paro, who was the weakest and meekest of her friends, died ahead of everyone else. Paro, Zainab, Begum, Sham Kaur. Domestic women, veiled women, the very embodiment of virtue, crossed the dark alley of cruelty, carrying the love of their husbands and the milk of motherhood for their children in their bosoms. Their bodies were riddled with bullets, but their steps did not falter. Someone might have called out at that time with their love. Some little arms might have beckoned. Someone's charming smile might have been witnessed. But their spirit said, no, today you will not bend. Today, after centuries, has come the moment when all of Hindustan has awakened and is crossing this alley proudly, advancing with its head raised high. Zainab, Begum, Paro, Sham Kaur. Who says the Sita in this country has died? Who says that no Sati Savitri is born any longer in this land? Today, every particle of this alley is resplendent with the divine blood of a martyr. Sham Kaur, Zainab, Paro, Begum. Today, you yourselves have not crossed this alley with your heads raised. Today, your entire land is crossing this alley, its head raised with pride. Today, the raised flag of freedom is crossing this alley. Today, the respectable traditions of your land, your culture, your religion have come alive. Today, the head of humanity is raised with pride. 1,000, 1,000,000 salams on your spirits. Thank you.
That brings our session to a close.
Can we get any questions from the audience, Phil?
Yeah.
Quick questions. Right in the back.
Only compliments.
No, I mean, I'm just enthralled by the quality of the discussion and the sentiment. And even though this is very unfair to Professor Francis Robinson, with 3 hostile South Asians there, 1 Canadian, but the quality of the discourse was very informative and stimulating. So compliments to all 4 of you. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question back there.
Ji, my name is Adil Ahmed, sir. I am left speechless, as is to be expected. And a way forward की भी तो बात करें ना सर कुछ. Historians have a duty to shed some light on the way forward.
Well, the way forward, obviously, no one has a crystal ball, in his hand to predict the future. But, memory is very uncomfortable. I mean, there's a reason why the wrongs of colonialism they don't want them to remember, my friends in Lahore, I have some friends in Lums. They are first-class historians over there, Ali Usman, Kasmi, Ali Raza. They told me that they tried to approach the British consul if they would be interested in holding a centenary event on Jallianwala Bagh in Lums. Not even an acknowledgement of that email was received from the British consul. So how can you talk about a way forward in this situation, I mean, it is up to the subjects to remember, these tragedies and memory. And I think in the absence of anything else, it is memory which is a form of resistance. So we should continue to remember, even if no plaque is built, even if no memorial is built, we should continue to remember, because memory is, I think, a form of resistance. And in a world where there's a lot of amnesia, I mean, I remember how history is taught in England, how history is taught in our part of the world, So,
If I may take over from here, 1 sec. I do believe that memory needs to be kept alive in forums such as this, that's fine. But I think there needs to be created fiction that speaks to our times and is written for the mode where we read. We read about the Holocaust and we watch films about the Holocaust that speak to our times, such as Life is Beautiful, such as The Book Thief, that don't focus on the event itself. Now, when you look at the stars that are very distant, you have to look sometimes to the certain side of the stars to actually see the star. It's a blind spot is actually focusing on it. I don't think we can focus on the event anymore. There are so many stories around it. After 9/11, Don DeLillo wrote this short text about how we have to snatch the narrative back from the terrorists by writing about the everyday that happened within and around. Now, some of these stories did have that, but the tinge of melancholy, the tinge of the mode of writing that is tragic needs to be subverted. We need to see it in new light. Life was still happening around these events. And I think novelists now need to take up, and short stories now need to take up the event in new light. The tragic has been done. There needs to be comic. There needs to be something else.
Yeah, buy this book, that's a way forward. That could be a way forward.
Question in the front. Mike, please.
Did LUMS hold that seminar without the British Council?
They did without, I attended that seminar and they held it without the participation of the...
Okay, so then that's fine. You need many narratives to be written and spoken.
And there was ironically a British historian who was also part of that panel.
It's not ironical at all. I think it's appropriate. Thank you.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Yes.
I think having stated the truth, it's time for reconciliation. And we've seen how it's happened in South Africa. Perhaps belatedly, something could be initiated by the British Council itself.
Could I just add a comment? The various ironies associated with the aftermath of Jallianwala Bagh from a British point of view. One is that General Dyer was really a very sad man because he was actually a speaker of good Urdu, of Hindustani, a man who got on well with Indians. And so, in terms of his own life and his own affections, he suffered at that point. Secondly, the lieutenant governor of the Punjab, a man called O'Dwyer, was assassinated as a Punjabi response to Jallianwala Bagh. He was assassinated nearly 10 years later. And thirdly, I think it should be clear that Jallianwala Bagh actually undermined British morale in relation to empire. It had a considerable impact upon the British and their confidence in rule. Thank you.
I think that's it for the session. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you for listening and contributing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the most valued...